record, this is the Senate Judiciary and Public Safety Committee. Today's date is Monday, February 21st, 2022. And we have two bills on our agenda. Both of those will be laid over. But we will start with Senator Coleman with Senate File 2844. Senator Coleman, welcome to the committee. Would you describe your bill?
Yes, thank you. This is my first visit to
Oh,
the
wait a
Judiciary
second.
Committee.
We have a tradition in this Judiciary Committee.
Oh, boy.
Whenever a senator has a first bill. We're not going to describe that. You'll find out later.
I wait with
Right,
eager
Senator?
anticipation.
Right, Senator Pappas?
We're ready.
All right, good, good. Senator Coleman, proceed.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. This area of statute became important to me when my family, with my husband, my twins, and my toddler, were driving to St. Paul and found ourselves in the middle of a high-speed police chase. In a split second, my husband, who is a first responder, realized what was happening as we saw a trooper pulling a device to pop the tires of the person fleeing across the road to move over. And in what seemed like the longest second of my life, we heard screeching tires narrowly miss crumpling the back of my family minivan with my children inside. And when I realized that my family was a part of this, I wanted to do something about it. And so I asked our brilliant staff to look into this area of statute and find out what else can we be doing to make our roads safer. I've always understood fleeing a police officer is a horrible thing to do, but it wasn't until this experience that I realized through the help of our staff that there is a gap in our statute. So Senate File 2844 attempts to address that gap in statute. Fleeing on foot, as many of you know, is a misdemeanor. Fleeing with a motor vehicle has a range of penalties depending on the circumstances. I'm putting this in air quotes, simply fleeing in a motor vehicle is a 3-year felony right now, whether the person obeys all the other traffic laws or not. Fleeing in a motor vehicle and causing substantial bodily harm is a 5-year felony. However, there's a gap between the two. This bill adds a 4-year felony in between simply fleeing in a car and causing substantial bodily harm. Because as I experienced, there is a difference between someone who is trying to get away but is generally following traffic laws without putting people at a huge risk, and those who have a reckless disregard for the safety of everyone in their path as they are attempting to get away, such as reaching speeds of 100 or 120 miles per hour on a freeway, going the wrong direction on a freeway, running red lights, using dangerous speeds in residential neighborhoods, and placing people in harm's way in crowded parking lots. The way this bill is crafted is designed to cover these situations and more we have not even thought of yet or seen in the news. Because of the huge increase in stolen vehicles, carjackings, and criminals fleeing from peace officers and putting others at risk, I believe this enhanced penalty is necessary so we can reflect in statute that it is unacceptable to put everybody in harm's way as you are attempting to flee the police. And I believe I have testifiers, Mr. Chair. I'm not sure if they're here or online.
Thank you, Senator. We have Jeff Potts, Executive Director of the Minnesota Chiefs of Police. He is with us remotely. Chief Potts.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, and members of the committee. For the record, my name is Jeff Potts. I am the former Chief of Police from Bloomington and current Executive Director of the Minnesota Chiefs of Police Association. And our association represents over 300 police chiefs and law enforcement leaders from across the state. Our association wholeheartedly supports Senator Coleman's bill, Senate File 2844, that would increase the penalties on individuals who flee an officer in a vehicle and revoke their licenses if convicted. Just a little bit of data, police pursuits are up about 40% over the last 3 years. Starting in 2019, there were approximately 3,200 reported to the BCA by agencies across the state. And last year in 2021, there was 4,369 pursuits. And as police departments have adopted more restrictive pursuit policies, we have seen this dramatic increase in the number of fleeing cases. and the driving conduct of the violators has become even more reckless and dangerous. As Senator Coleman indicated in her story, this does create concerns to innocent motorists who happen to be on the roadway during these pursuits. And for those reasons, we thank Senator Coleman for her work on this important issue, and we urge the Senate to pass this important piece of legislation. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the opportunity to testify here with you today.
Thank you, Chief Potts. Is there any questions for the chief? Chief, I have a couple questions to ask you. You obviously know of a number of different fleeing events from a peace officer. Can you tell me what goes on in the mind of an officer when he's got someone fleeing? What would be the first and foremost thought going in someone's mind that's trying to catch someone like that?
Like Mr. Chair, I can tell you that that they're very concerned about the safety of everybody else involved, and so they're constantly trying to do a risk analysis of how long they're going to continue in the pursuit. That is sometimes dependent on the violation, but there's also a lot of other factors because these pursuits are incredibly dangerous to everyone that's involved, not just the person that is being pursued, but to the police officer and everyone else on the road. And I can tell you that that is front and center in their mind at the moment that pursuit begins.
Chief, I would imagine that if I was a law enforcement officer, I'd probably be thinking about that too. I'd be thinking about the safety of others and what kind of danger that that particular driver is causing those around, or for that matter, if there's, in the case of Senator Coleman with her family, I would imagine it's quite harrowing when someone blasts past their car going at an exceptionally high speed. Not to mention the possibility of losing control of one's vehicle, not the police officer's vehicle. They're well trained to handle that, but an individual who's flying down the freeway, making more of an emotional issue than a thoughtful one, doesn't necessarily have that same training with a high-speed car. Senator Ingebrigtsen,
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
You've got law enforcement background. Anything to add?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. No, with regards to that question, I do have. I mean, it's a very high risk, high intense situation. I remember being in some chases myself, and I don't know, other than having a gun pointed at you, where there is a more tense situation. But the questions that I have of the chief is, you had some good statistics there. Can you tell the committee how many chases were actually, I think you talked about executed chases. There were, how many of those were actually where either the Clio or the officer in charge called it off? And do you have any statistics on how much property damage or physical damage has been done over the years of those particular numbers that you gave us?
Chief Potts.
Mr. Chair and Senator, I don't have the specific detailed data that you're asking for, but I can speak kind of from my experience in the city where I was the chief of police, and can tell you that probably around 70 or 80% of those pursuits are called off because the risk analysis was such that it just was not worth it to continue on. The danger to everybody else involved was just too high. And I would just guess that plays out, that type of ratio probably plays out across the state. With regard to the total number or the amount of damage, because again, the vast majority of these pursuits are terminated because the risk analysis is too high. Fortunately, we avoid that, but there are plenty that end up with damage to either the vehicles and or damage to other people's vehicles that are on the road, or property that gets damaged at the end of the pursuit. But again, I want to stress to this committee that as law enforcement agencies have adopted more restrictive policies with regard to pursuits, that seems to be a factor in why there are so many pursuits taking place, that perhaps the violators are confident that they can get away. But what we have seen in the recent past is this very reckless and dangerous driving conduct, going into oncoming traffic or oncoming lanes of highways and freeways, which can be obviously very deadly. But again, the officers are constantly trying to do that risk analysis, and the vast majority of these pursuits do get terminated prior to the violator actually stopping.
Mr. Chair, if I could follow up with that.
Senator Ingebrigtsen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And you know, that's something you never hear. You never hear about those where the officer's judgment was utilized and stop chasing. The old rule is if you don't chase somebody, they're not going to run. And I think that's pretty fair. However, you know, is the public, and I'm not going to criticize, I'm just going to say for folks to consider that when they stop a chase and when they, you know, back off of something, what are they backing off of? It might not just be a taillight. It may not be just a license plate expiration. It might have been a shop and rob someplace. Who knows? They might have a body in the trunk. I mean, you just never know. And, you know, as an officer that was involved in that kind of stuff, it was really hard for me not to do that, not to pursue that. But at the same time, you're endangering a lot of other people, especially if you're in a rural area coming into a city. It becomes a whole different game again. So, but you're never going to hear that from our media. You're never going to hear those decisions that are made. You're only going to hear about the ones that end in tragedy, and that's really unfortunate. So, just wanted to make sure everybody knew that, you know, the feeling of the officer out there, I think is very intense, and all these things are all, of course, just, you know, real quick judgment decisions that have to be made, and so I'm very in charge, very happy Senator Coleman brought this forward, and I think the chief might be right. They may be catching on to the game, and that might be the reason why half of these people are running. And again, you don't ever know what they're running from. So.
Thank you, Senator. I had opened it up for questions because our second testifier was not in the room. However, Senator Latz had his hand up, and I was wondering, Senator Latz, do you have a question for Chief Potts?
Mr. Chairman, I can hold my question until the testimony is done. I think Senator Matthews also had his hand up before mine, so I'll wait my turn.
Senator Matthews.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I do have a question for Chief Potts. I was actually going to ask what Senator Ingebrigtsen asked as well, but I would like to ask even one step further, because I do think this is a growing issue. You know, even doing recent news searches, this comes up as multiple occurrences of these high-speed chases, even recently. This clearly is becoming a problem. But my question, Chief Potts, in addition to the numbers that you shared about chases that officers call off, are there any suspects that legitimately get away, or do you have a pretty good track record of being able to follow up and apprehend 100% or close to these people after the fact? And what does that usually look like? Do you find the car again and you end up initiating another high-speed chase? Do you find out their location and go arrest them at home? I'd kind of like to know, even one step deeper, if people think they can truly get away and are getting away, or if you're able to still track them down and safely apprehend them later.
Chief Potts.
Mr. Chair and Senator Matthews, that is a good question. I can tell you that law enforcement is doing a lot more to try to figure out who it was that was in that car. And maybe when the pursuit terminated, we don't catch them immediately. But there are more and more tools and resources being brought to this issue. For example, working with Colonel Langer and the State Patrol, that they are using aircraft to help in following the car. And so that when they do eventually stop, we're able to have a specific location. But there are other investigative means. Now, for example, if you're chasing a stolen car, obviously that's not the owner in the car, and so it gets to be pretty difficult. But if you can recover the car and do some investigative work, oftentimes you can find out who was in the vehicle. but that's challenging. That does not happen 100% of the time by any means. But I can tell you that law enforcement agencies don't just turn off the lights and end the pursuit and not do anything else. They do try and use whatever investigative tools they have to try to locate, identify the driver and locate them. But it's very challenging. Again, we're using air support and some other things in the recent past. At least we're using them more than we used to try to help us in that area, but it is a challenge.
Senator Pappas? Did you want to hold questions or did you?
Mr. Chairman, I'll hold my question until after the next testifier.
Senator Bingham.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just had to ask a question after that last comment with Executive Director Potts. I think there's a couple of us that, and I think it's Senator Johnson that's chief authoring it, but there's a few bills out there about GPS on stolen vehicles. And I'm wondering if you also think that that would be a helpful tool to move along to address this epidemic of stolen vehicles and carjackings.
Chief Potts, it's a little off subject, but while we have you here.
Mr. Chair and Senator Bingham, I'm not sure who the other testifier is. Maybe if it's Sheriff Fletcher, he may be able to give you a more detailed response to this. But that GPS bill that you're talking about would help because again, there's a significant portion of these pursuits that are stolen vehicles. And again, that's another tool that can be used to locate that car, obviously without a pursuit. And so I think that is a tool that would be very helpful in this. Again, a significant portion of these pursuits are related to vehicles that were stolen, not all of them, but it's a significant portion, and that would be a useful tool in that endeavor.
Sheriff Fletcher. Welcome to the committee.
Mr. Chair, thank you. Sorry for my tardiness, and I do want to mention, and I
Would
know
you identify yourself for the record
yeah,
first?
Bob Fletcher, Ramsey County Sheriff. I know Senator Pappas will be concerned about this. We had a multiple shooting this morning at 11:20 over at a funeral home on Humboldt. 6 people, maybe more, were shot. 1 is deceased. And so, you know, our troops are out there looking for the potential suspects. But our condolences to, you know, your residents and constituents there. First of all, I had a chance to listen to Senator Coleman in the Transportation Committee. She explains it better than I do. So I'll be brief, but this is just one of several tools that we believe we need to help curtail high-speed chases. As you know, we want the ability to track cars that are stolen as well. We advocate for increasing the auto theft fund, auto theft crime prevention under the Department of Commerce. The flight services of the State Patrol are extremely beneficial. But this is one thing we think aggravating the sentences for people that are fleeing in a manner that is likely to cause some type of death or injury, but does not. And the messaging that goes out to the offenders, which they are repeat offenders, is very simple, that if you go on the wrong side of the road, you're driving 100 miles plus, you're going to get an additional sentence, hopefully higher points on the sentencing scale as well. All of that contributes to our ability to convince offenders not to run and to prosecute and to put them in jail when they do. On the issue, Senator Matthews, regarding how often we are able to arrest people that flee, not often at all. I will tell you, it's clearly less than 20%, might be 10%. And that's if we have some form of camera identification or we've seen them, or we more likely than not will end up chasing them a second time. But it's a very small number. And that's part of our problem, is that the question was what percentage. I know Chief Potts said 70 to 80%. I would say in the metro, 90% of chases are terminated. The metro has a higher density of people and buildings and things that you could be run into. Outstate, clearly it's a smaller number because they have wide areas, the likelihood of injuring someone. But in the metro, 90%, probably outstate, 70% of chases are terminated. 20 years from now, we probably won't be sitting here because the auto industry will probably figure out a way to track every car. We do use GPS tracking. that the owners have access to. We're on a regular basis contacting Sirius Radio and OnStar to help track these cars when we find them. Our goal, at least at the sheriff's office, is not to just chase them. Our goal is to find a way to corral them, box them in using unmarked cars and curtail having a chase. But our second goal is also to put a GPS tracker on them before they take off. So then we can pick and choose our spots. The best tactic is to find them when they're not expecting us to be chasing them, when they're pulled into a parking lot. We can block them in a snowbank. We look for these opportunities to not have chases because they are dangerous. They're dangerous for our officers as well. And it's no secret, friends of mine died, in a chase on the east side many years ago. So we try to minimize them, and we're just asking you for an additional tool in the toolbox to help minimize the number of chases.
Thanks, Sheriff. We'll open it up for questions. Senator Latz?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wonder if either Senator Coleman or either of the testifiers have any information, any data, or statistics that would indicate that increasing the penalty would be effective in deterring the fleeing conduct.
Senator Coleman?
Mr. Chair, I will defer to either of my testifiers or Senate counsel if they have any data on this.
Sheriff Fletcher?
Senator Latz, I have no research evidence whatsoever to say that increasing penalties on this particular matter will deter them. I can tell you anecdotally, over 44 years, having interviewed hundreds of suspects, they care about the sentence. And I can tell you for certain that if they're in jail for a longer period of time, they're less likely to run from us a second time.
Follow up, Senator Latz?
Thank you. That my general approach to these things is that the likelihood of getting caught is probably a greater deterrent than, at least if you're working around the margins, the increasing penalties by 1 year maximum for prison. But it sounds like the likelihood of getting caught in these kind of situations is fairly low, especially since a large proportion of those who are fleeing are doing so in stolen vehicles. And that may be more a function in the metro area. I know there's probably more fleeing going on along Highway 35 between the northern suburbs and Duluth, just because it's a long straight road and a lot of vehicles tend to speed at a high speed anyway. And I know that the officers who are watching there have to make that decision quite frequently about, following up with a chase. So I was just curious of whether or not we had any data relating to effectiveness. I do also have a question, if I may, about the standard that's in the bill here. The culpable negligence, and maybe counsel can help here, but I can't think of any other provision in state law where culpable negligence is a standard for liability, or either civil or criminal liability. Am I accurate on that, or am not familiar with the place where it is already the standard?
Why don't we ask counsel, Mr. Backus?
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Senator Latz. Culpable negligence is used elsewhere. I don't have the exact list. I'm looking for it, but I can tell you for sure we use it in the second-degree manslaughter crime. And that's where this language came from, is second-degree manslaughter.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Do we know, is there any case law that's looked into that or that's evaluated that as well?
Mr. Backus?
Mr. Chair, it's second degree manslaughter, I think is charged fairly often. I could read you the jury, the crim jig to describe what the conduct is, if you'd like that.
Mr. Chairman, is that any different than what's in the proposed bill language? Or does the crim jig pretty much adopt the language that's in the statute?
Well, the
Mr.
crim
Backus.
jig adds to the language,
It would be-
so,
I would find that helpful, Mr. Chairman, if Mr. Backus could do that.
yeah. Mr. Chair, so the
Backus.
additional information the crim jig gives is it describes the conduct as intentional conduct that the defendant may not have intended to be harmful, but that an ordinary and reasonably prudent person would recognize as involving a strong probability of injury to others. It continues to say it is more than ordinary negligence. It is more than gross negligence. It is gross negligence coupled with an element of recklessness.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
Thank you. That's very helpful. That we already have a standard in statute, because I wasn't familiar with that particular language, and I think that's good, because I was concerned about what I thought might be the creation of a new standard that it was different than reckless driving, for example. So, and then the only other question that I had about this particular bill has to do with the driver's license revocation. And I know if there's a conviction for, I guess, a subdivision 3 felony fleeing, which is basically even failing to stop for a peace officer that gives a signal to the driver, is a felony offense. Can result in, I think it's 1 year driver's license revocation. I might be corrected on that by counsel. This one, I think, results in a longer license revocation as well. And I guess I'd like to know, is there a limited license available for a portion of that? How long is a license revocation? And is there any other mechanism to get reinstated during such a license revocation? Part of the reason I ask, and this has been a much bigger topic, I know the chairman and I have both had, addressed these issues over the years about the value of license revocation as a deterrent to conduct, and the frequency of driving after revocation cases coming through the system, where people feel like they get caught between keeping their jobs and therefore paying their rent and food for the family, and driving or following the abiding by the revocation of the driving privileges. So you end up with an awful lot. In some jurisdictions, 40% or more of their cases are driving after withdrawal cases. I just want to see if we've, where this one falls in that range, what the options will be, and whether from that standpoint, we're creating a problem at the same time we're trying to solve one.
Mr. Backus, did you have anything to add to the conversation regarding Senator Latz's concern about driver license revocation?
Mr. Chair, members, I think two things. One is if you look on page 1, line 13 of the bill, that's current law in terms of driver license revocation for fleeing offenses. So under current law, a first offense, subdivision 3, which is your basic offense with no harm caused, that's a year revocation. Then if it's a second offense, it's 3 years. This new offense slots in at 4 years. And then if you drop down to line 1.21, you'll see the offense where you have substantial bodily harm to another, that's 5 years. So this kind of slots in there. And then if there's if there's great bodily harm, it's a 7-year revocation. And if there's death, then it's 10 years. I don't have an answer right now on the limited license issue. That's something I'd have to look into.
Senator Latz?
Well, I'm trying to think about proportionality here as well as effectiveness. And I mean, this is not the kind of situation where, for example, ignition interlock would be a valuable tool, because interlock is an alcohol-related solution to getting people safely back on the road. And of course, this offense has nothing in its elements relating to alcohol. So I guess I have to think about that, whether 4 years would be proportional, whether maybe 2 years would be more proportional on a first offense, and then 4 years on a second offense. Whether that might make a little more sense. I guess I'd like to look into more about the availability of a limited license. I mean, my recollection, and I might be wrong on this, but my recollection is that maybe on a first offense, the 1 year, I think maybe the first 180 days is without a limited. People are going to follow that, especially in rural Minnesota, where it's hard to get a bus or Uber, let alone walk to work or take a bike to work. And it might create more hardship without being particularly effective in stopping people from driving, especially with these penalties. And then the last question I'll ask, and I'm just kind of thinking this through, not necessarily proposing a change on this, but the efficacy of having the behavior that's involved here in a fleeing offense under the current statute is pretty wide ranging. I mean, increase in speed, which could be, adding 5 miles an hour to the speed that they're going, extinguishing the headlights or taillights, refusing to stop the vehicle, or using other means with intent to attempt or elude a peace officer. Could mean a right-hand turn onto a deserted road would be considered fleeing under the statute. And so for me, that kind of behavior might be more appropriate as a gross misdemeanor. And then making the kind of behavior that we're targeting here, sort of the high-speed chase, endangering others behavior, might be more appropriate as the felony. And, whatever the number of years are that I think is appropriate. But I'm just trying to think of proportionality here and within the statute. Because I'm just not sure that it makes a lot of sense for someone who, for 30 seconds decides they're going to step on the gas and they end up going 10 miles an hour faster than they were before, and then say, oh, this is stupid. And then they back off and they pull over. But in the meantime, you've got the officer that was trying to stop them has a front-facing radar that now has them going from 60 miles an hour to 70 miles an hour in a 55 zone. And they're facing a felony criminal charge with the potential of substantial, jail or prison time. And I'm just wondering if that's the right statutory scheme or penalty scheme that we should have here. And maybe I'm just kind of opening that conversation up for consideration as we try to fit this provision into our statutes, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Latz. Just a reminder, we will be laying this bill over. We'll have lots of time to ferret this out a little bit, and it may require us going back to Transportation Committee with some of those suggestions. Senator Pappas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll lower my hand if I can figure out how to do it. First of all, I want to thank Sheriff Fletcher for those comments. I didn't realize that there were that many people injured from the news story I saw this morning. Yeah, I mean, thank you for your comments. And I'm so sorry to Senator Coleman that you had that terrifying experience on the freeway. That's never fun, especially when you have your kids in the car with you. I do have some concerns about whether, about there being no data, that this is actually a deterrent. And, it may have been a young juvenile that panicked. It could be a carjacker or not, or could just be somebody who's an inexperienced driver. And that especially concerns me because, juveniles, they don't really think about consequences. Their brains haven't developed that far. And so I don't know that this would be a deterrent to any kind of juvenile driver that's 16, 17, 18 years old. Because I don't think especially when we don't have any data to prove that this would be effective. I really would like us to think of kind of other options that we might be able to use to deal with people driving too fast. We have a lot of that going on right now. To like Sheriff Fletcher mentioned, some kind of aerial or GPS tracking of someone and not have these high-speed chases. So I share some of Senator Latz's concerns as well.
Thank you, Senator Pappas. Senator Pappas, I was recently this summer, I think Senator Bigham was with us too, up at the state trooper training up at Camp Ripley. And they did a facsimile chase in a squad car following someone else, but as soon as a helicopter was in the air, and once the patrol car knew, the driver knew there was eyes in the sky, they slowed down. And they're even to the point that they lose eye contact with the car, but yet the helicopter does not. And I asked the pilot later, is there a problem in a high urban environment? He said, no, it's really a very successful way to track someone and do it safely once you know, because all you want to know is where is the car going? And if it stops, as Sheriff Fletcher has said, the point is trying to catch the individual, but do it in a safe way. And if the car is stopped or moving very slowly, that's the best time you can pick your moment. So we do have that, at least training in the state patrol, and I believe other law enforcement agencies are doing the same thing. Yes, Senator Pappas.
I did have a follow-up because I also wanted to ask Chief Potts if he had any information or any data about increasing penalties being a deterrent.
Chief Potts.
Mr. Chair, Senator Pappas, I don't have specific data. I would echo the comments that the sheriff made, but I don't have specific data on that. We can do some checking if this bill is laid over and perhaps provide data in a subsequent hearing.
Senator Kittmeyer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Very interesting discussion. I especially appreciate Senator Latz, because I know a lot of his legal work has to do with being a defense attorney. So I know his questions and other things. He has a perspective that I think is important to this committee. But I was also thinking, though, of the question, I think there was another bill in regards to this, does advertising work? Questioning the efficacy of the advertising. What amazing to me, if that's the case, then at the Super Bowl, people wasted a lot of money because obviously advertising doesn't work, right? I still remember the Budweiser frog commercial, you know, and that's maybe too old for some. It's still a good one. At any rate, I think it's really important to realize it's not because you can tie a particular commercial to a specific purchase of a product. It doesn't work that way. Kind of in general, raising your interest and all of that. So when I look at this and say, do consequences matter? It does. And right now in the general conversation out there, the message is you can get away with it. And that affects overall, not specifically, but it affects saying, yeah, it looks like we can get away with it. So some of them it's for a lark, others, they just are wanting to get away with it. And to think that this is a victimless crime, that you get that sometimes, oh, they're just running away. No, they're running away because they did something. A carjacking, Senator Coleman, like your situation, or a crime of beating up on somebody and they're fleeing. I mean, these are really important, serious issues. And the law enforcement out there are there to capture and protect and deter. And so incentives like this also are created. So the conversations that there will be tougher consequences, you can't tie it necessarily to exactly the next crime. But in general, it has an impact to those who have this kind of mind of thinking, that they're going to say it's, oh, gee, if I do get caught or when I do get caught, there's going to be a serious consequence to this. And it'll make them think twice or hopefully not do it at all. So it's the general conversation, specificness. The other thing is those, we all know the word of mouth. And so you may have advertising, but the best advertising is a good experience. Well, they talk amongst each other as well. They're getting caught, the chance of having a serious time in prison. These things do matter. And so bills like this, Senator Coleman, you bring it forward, they do have an effect. The conversation is there, but there needs to be these kinds of consequences because that is what makes the difference in a rule of law. Because if there are no consequences, then what's the point? Then you might as well have chaos and great deal of harm. There's got to be consequences, and especially on crimes that endanger people have great consequences of serious harm. I know people who've been in these situations and their lives have been drastically changed because of that. We need to stop that. And if this deterrent, not because it's tied to a specific law or specific crime, but in general, these deterrents can save lives. That's what's really important here. And we stand up for that. And I think that's very important. So of course, I'm supporting this bill and appreciate the comments that have been made here. But if we don't have consequences, we have chaos, and that is not good for Minnesotans. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Ingebrigtsen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just a couple of comments. We're talking about statistics here, and I know Senator Pappas had brought up the idea of deterring. And when you're dealing with juveniles that don't think very well, and it's unfortunate they do get lost in the juvenile justice system. But I do remember, and it's a long time ago, that if you stole a car back in the 70s and maybe even early 80s, if you stole a car, you actually went to a detention facility for an extended period of time. I'm not saying that we should bring that back, but right now it seems like you have to steal 5 or 6 cars before you even get honorable mention, before you even get any kind of jail time. And maybe that's kind of a broad statement, but I would like to ask the sheriff, because I know he was around as long as I have been. Are you seeing more juvenile crime now, the sheriff, especially within the last 3 years? I think that's what Chief Potts was talking about, was in the last 3 years when you've seen a lot of more serious crime. Is it happening that juveniles are doing more of these crimes more and more all the time?
Sheriff Fletcher.
Mr. Chair, Senator Ingebrigtsen, yes, absolutely. Juveniles are committing a higher percentage of crime than in the past. Clearly, auto thefts are one example, carjackings are another, but also our shootings and gang-related shootings tend to be predominantly juveniles as well. Part of that is that younger and younger children are involved with crime, and part of it is always the demographic numbers of the number of children in that age group. Our crime trends do tend to follow those baby booms in terms of how many children that there are. But yes.
Thank you.
So just a comment, and thank you for that. Thanks for the great discussion. It appears that the juveniles know that they can commit these crimes. They can continue on that crime spree for quite some time before anything really happens to them. So I applaud Senator Coleman for bringing this bill forward, and I'll be voting in favor of it.
Mr. Chair.
Sheriff Fletcher.
Just one last piece to the puzzle regarding juveniles. One of the issues is whether or not juveniles are held, as Senator Ingebrigtsen talked about. And I think there is a growing consensus that more juvenile offenders need to be held for at least a period of time until the justice system can figure out what the right balance is. This particular language in this bill adds the concept of them being a danger to the community, to others, and officers. That generally is the threshold of decision-making, whether they're kept in detention for any period of time. If we have to establish that releasing them would endanger others, and if we can't establish that, so for instance, the typical auto thief juvenile that goes to detention is released in a very short period of time, sometimes hours, almost always within 24 hours. But if there is a high-speed chase where they're endangering others, et cetera, there's a possibility. Clearly, carjackers are held. But as you know, Senator Edelson herself has authored a bill requiring detention. And we concur that we need more time to detain these juveniles before a decision is made. And this bill will also enhance the offense that they're charged with. Now, on the issue of discretion, discernment as to what they're charged with, rest assured the juvenile justice system in Minnesota is going to ultimately make that decision. And you're going to have much more discussion, I think, this session about the prosecutors making those decisions. But I wouldn't worry too much about the sentence itself. actually requiring them to be detained, because ultimately the prosecutors in our justice system make those final decisions.
Thank you. Senator Bingham.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I know the intent is to lay this over. I just wanted to make just some general comments. One, I think there is not just one solution to this problem, and I think it's going to take many different facets that many have been mentioned today. So I do hope, as we're building a bill that we will send out of here, it does include a lot of the items that not only Sheriff Fletcher and Director Potts have mentioned, but I think it's important to include programming for youth intervention and juvenile justice programs as well, because I think that that is also part of the solution. And I'm supportive of this bill. I have a similar one that Senator Coleman is also on with me. And so I do think that as this goes through the process, we can fine tune it. But I think it's a good idea to keep an open mind about not having just one finite solution to solve this problem that really is impacting almost every community, especially the regional centers in the state.
Thank you, Senator. Mr. Backus wanted to weigh in here. Mr. Backus.
Mr. Chair and members, I'm sorry. Would this be an appropriate time? This goes back to Senator Latz's question earlier about the limited license.
Why don't we, Senator Latz wanted to make a comment on this line of conversation, and then we can get to you, Mr. Backus. Senator Latz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on something Senator Kiffmeyer said. But I want to preface it by saying that I recognize that the gap is in the statute here. Pretty big gap between the fairly minimal conduct that can result in a felony fleeing and the pretty substantial conduct that results in substantial bodily harm or death. So I see where this fits in, and I'm generally supportive of the concept. The question of there being consequences, this is not a zero consequences versus, versus 4-year felony in prison kind of consequences, or maximum penalties anyway. This is going from a 3-year maximum to a 4-year maximum. So the question I raise in terms of deterrence is whether or not that additional 1 year in the maximum penalty provisions would, as a practical matter, result in any additional deterrence, and whether that's worth the additional cost that'll be involved. I like to do things that are effective, and if we do things that are not effective, I think it ends up reducing the people who believe in the value of a statute. In fact, it reduces effectiveness overall in terms of compliance if we put statutes on the books that don't have their intended effect. So that's why I raised the question analytically. And I think it's worth considering as we decide how exactly to fashion and where it fits in to the statute. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Latz, are you suggesting an even higher penalty than what's suggested in the bill?
Mr. Chairman, I was actually suggesting we consider whether or not the lower level fleeing might be more appropriately up to a year in jail, which is still pretty substantial for someone to face. That's a gross misdemeanor maximum. And then maybe find a more mid-range felony, maybe 2 years or 3 years as a maximum penalty for a culpable negligence kind of conduct. And that's something.
I'm glad I asked that question. I was thinking you were going to 5 or 6. So just clarifying, sir, on that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Let's see. We'll move on to Mr. Backus now.
Mr. Chair, yeah, so just to try to answer Senator Latz's question before, the limited license statute is a really dense statute to try to work one's way through, but I'm pretty sure though that fleeing peace officer revocations are included in it so that a person is eligible for a limited license. And I do believe there would be a 60-day waiting period before one could get one because it would be considered a felony in which the commission of a motor vehicle was used. So I believe a person would be eligible after a 60-day waiting period.
Ms. Backus, I know that your suggestion there were tiptoeing into primarily the Transportation Committee jurisdiction, although we would have a little oversight on that. But I think we've had a very good discussion on this particular bill, raised a lot of suggestions as well as questions, and we will lay this bill over for now, for later in the session, and we'll move on to our next bill.
Mr. Chair,
Sheriff.
just one last thing in case I don't. Senator Kiffmeyer, Senator Ingebrigtsen, and Senator Bingham, thank you for all your support over the years of law enforcement. We are really going to miss you three in the future. So thank you. And if there's other people that are leaving, my apologies, but you're the only three that I'm aware of. So thank you.
Not voluntarily.
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, Senator Latz.
if I may, just to follow up on, I was going to say Senator Backus, because we all fall into that every now and then.
Pretty
Mr.
close.
Backus, I did find a grid from the Department of Public Safety that addresses the issue of violations, and he's absolutely right. 171.174 is extraordinarily complicated. But the grid that I have from the department is that a first year violation of 0.487 subdivision 3 is a 1-year revocation. But the grid I have, and no limited for half the revocation period, and then must have a recommendation from the adjudicating court before a limited may be issued. I'm not in the habit of contradicting Mr. Backus, but I was able to find this data, which I think will be helpful for the future. And anyone reading those statutes knows you almost have to put a painstaking grid together to figure out where everything fits. But thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Well, thank you, Senator Latz. We'll move on to the next bill. We've laid over Senate File 2844. And we will move on to Senate File 2843, Senator Osmek. Senator Osmek, welcome back to the Judiciary.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As much as I enjoy the Judiciary Committee, I hope this is my only appearance this year.
We always want to make your visit enjoyable.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Senate File 2843 entails enhanced penalties for certain thefts. Members, the Minnesotans, I believe, are becoming rather frustrated with individuals who are carjacking or stealing vehicles and then using them to commit subsequent crimes, particularly felonies. And this particular bill increases the penalty for the crime of auto theft significantly and justly, in my opinion. Mr. Chair, I would appreciate to get the bill in order to discuss it. I'd appreciate if one of your members would offer the A3 amendment. This is an author's amendment in the primary jurisdiction for the bill.
Members, we have an author's amendment. It should be in your packets, the A3 amendment. It's an author's amendment, and this bill is in its primary jurisdiction. Senator Matthews moves the A3 amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The amendment is adopted. Senator Osmek.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So members, what this does is it increases the penalty from 5 years or 10 years. It adds an additional 5 years to a motor theft of a motor vehicle where it is used in an additional capacity to commit a felony within 72 hours. The amendment, members, primarily focuses on the definition of which offenses are actually inclusive of this penalty. That starts on line 1.24 and goes through 3.2.
You're on the amendment language. Senator,
On the amendment
correct?
language, correct, Mr. Chair.
That reference was 1.24 through
3.2.
3.2.
And that's where the definitions are. And I guess the bill is rather self-explanatory. This is putting more teeth into particular crimes when a motor vehicle theft is used and the subsequent activity as defined by now by the bill, by the specific call outs of the particulars of the additional violations, be it murder of an unborn child, just to go through a few of them, solicitation of children, malicious punishment of a child. There's a lot in those lines of where the bill is going to be adding that additional 5 years. And with that, members, I certainly stand for any questions. I think this is the right direction to go. It puts additional teeth into a problem that we are experiencing in Minnesota. And I would hope to have your support to consider this in your omnibus bill. I do have one testifier, Jeff Potts. Sheriff Fletcher, I think, is still here. He may be interested in chiming in on that, but I would defer to Mr. Potts for additional for testimony, as well as Mr. Fletcher, or Sheriff Fletcher, if you'd like to.
Director Potts, would you want to offer testimony?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And we, the Minnesota Chiefs Association, is very appreciative and supports Senate File 2843. We appreciate Senator Osmek, your efforts for bringing this forward to address this. This is, again, similar to the conversation we had just a few minutes ago. We've seen a dramatic increase in motor vehicle thefts. And this will help address some of those more serious and dangerous crimes that happen as a result of that auto theft. Just a little bit of data. Since 2018, so for the last 3 years that we have data, we have seen in Hennepin County auto thefts go from a little bit over 3,000 in 2018. In 2021, that number was now over 6,000. So about a doubling of auto thefts in that one county. This is a staggering increase, one that I've never seen in my 30-year law enforcement career. And to make matters worse, we've seen that and many of these reports involve these auto thefts happening while the owner or another occupant is inside the vehicle. These carjackings have been violent, very traumatic for those people that are involved in it, where they almost always include either actual weapon or the threat use of a weapon or fear of a physical assault on the people inside the vehicle. And so for those reasons, we thank Senator Osmek for his work on this important issue. And again, we urge the Senate to pass this bill and send a message to criminals that they will be held accountable for these very violent crimes. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the opportunity to testify here today.
Thank you. Senator Fletcher, would you want to give testimony? I'm sorry, I insulted you again and I called you a senator.
The senators are leaving to run for county boards, if I'm not here.
Be careful.
You know where the money is.
Mr. Chair, just to point out that today's environment, it's no longer just joyriding. When you hear people say these kids are just out joyriding, why do we really care? They're stealing cars to commit other crimes. The car is a tool. I call it a passport to other crimes. They're using some stolens to carjack others. They're robbing people of their purses and phones. And so auto theft has become a tool to the next economic crime. And they're involved in chases on a daily basis. I mean, I had a deputy back here that's one of our finest at catching them, but these cars are running from us on a regular basis, stealing another car, etc. We just arrested a 14-year-old in Oakdale 2 mornings ago that it was sleeping on a Glock gun in his house because now he's worried about conflict with other groups that are stealing cars. So it's not the joyriding that it was of 10 years ago, 5 years ago. The game has changed, and anything you can do to enhance this penalty would be helpful to law enforcement.
Thank you. We'll open it up for questions. Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Appreciate that. So when I'm looking at this, this is regarding, this is not carjacking, this is simply vehicle theft. Now, when you hear about these crimes, it seems to me that it's more than one person that's committing these crimes at one time. What is a typical pattern? I think this is a question maybe for Mr. Potts. What is a typical pattern of a car theft?
Director Potts, do you understand the question?
Mr. Chair, Senator Johnson, are you the typical pattern in terms of how they progress to the point in time when they are stealing cars? Or I guess my initial reaction is that oftentimes an individual doesn't just steal one car. It happens repeatedly, and not, I guess I don't have a experience.
Maybe I should, Mr. Chair, maybe I should clarify. I apologize, that wasn't clear. So is it typically just a lone actor in these car thefts, or is it, are we looking at gangs? Are we looking at, pairs of people doing this? What is the usual, suspects that are doing this?
Director Potts.
Mr. Chair, Senator Johnson, it's oftentimes it is groups. A car theft can be one person who steals a car because they need transportation. A carjacking oftentimes is a group of individuals, as the sheriff mentioned. Very frequently, it's a group of juveniles. But it can be, it would be not very often where it's a single person. Oftentimes, carjackings are a group of people. A auto theft could be just an individual that sees a vehicle and steals it because they have something else they need to do. And so it's across the board. It can be individuals, it can be groups. I think the carjacking situations are typically multiple people involved in them, whereas an auto theft may just be an individual involved.
Mr. Chair.
Senator Johnson.
So I'm just trying to get into the mechanics of the bill a little bit. So if it's a group that's doing this, let's say it's an instance where a group is doing it, the culpability of that follow-up crime within that 72-hour period, who would be, if one individual steals it and then another person within the group follows up with a crime afterwards, who gets charged out on that crime? How does that work practically? I think that would be maybe for council to address. I'm slightly confused.
Mr. Backus, did you hear the question?
Mr. Chair, I did. I think Senate File 2843, if you look on lines 116 to 118, I mean, it's structured so that it kind of, I think, envisions mostly a single actor. So a person who steals the vehicle and then uses the vehicle within 72 hours in furtherance of the felony crime of violence. So if in order for it to apply to, say, multiple people, they would both have to be essentially convicted of stealing the car and committing the other crime.
Senator Johnson.
So that might be one thing. I know we're laying this over, so maybe that's one thing we can look at going forward. The other thing that I'm curious about, and I'm sure there are some reasons behind it, is the 72-hour period that the crimes can follow. Why the limited period like that?
Senator Osmek.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Senator Johnson, 72 was just the starting point. I think you could make a debate that it could be 5 days, it could be 10 days. I think you start to, the longer distance you get farther away from having the acts perhaps connected to each other. But I am more than willing, as this bill moves forward, to consider other timeframes. 72 just seemed to be a more tight number to the number of hours that it took place in, so you could actually legitimately argue that the two are connected.
That's all. Thank you.
Any other questions? Mr. Backus, Senator Latz, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sort of along the lines of what Senator Johnson was acting. I wonder if I can get a little more clarity on what using the vehicle in furtherance of a crime of violence means.
Why don't we ask counsel on that? He helped draft that definition, Mr. Backus.
Mr. Chair, members, in furtherance of is not defined in the bill. It is used in somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 or 7 other times in the criminal code. I assume it's the type of thing where, you know, I'm not aware of it being defined in any jury instructions. I didn't do a definitive look, but I think the jury or the judge will have to kind of define that kind of on their own, just using normal means like dictionaries.
I mean, I guess I'd be curious to get a little more clarity on that. You know, if it means that the vehicle is used to drop a passenger off at a house, and that passenger later engaged in a felony level assault, is that considered in furtherance of, or is it not? If let's say the passenger had been the one that stole the vehicle a week earlier, and then passenger's friend is later driving that vehicle and drops passenger off, who commits a felony level crime of violence. I mean, maybe there's no real way to be a little more clear on that, and that's sort of just what we have juries to make the factual determinations for. But I think it's worth thinking about. I was also wondering whether or not and I haven't looked through the whole list of crimes of violence here, but is there necessarily a connection between any of the crimes of violence that are listed in the A3 Amendment and motor vehicles? There seem to be, you know, they got a bunch of Chapter 152 controlled substance crimes in there. Possession of substances with intent to manufacture methamphetamine, conspiracy to commit a violation of Chapter 152. That might be extraordinarily broad, because Chapter 152 contains all of the drug crimes in Minnesota statutes. Aiding suicide or aiding attempted suicide is listed in there. I mean, there's just simple, well, I mean, there's some things which might make more sense because you would anticipate there might be a vehicle involved in the commission of the follow-up crime. I mean, there are a number of criminal sexual conduct things where, again, if the criminal sexual conduct occurs in the stolen motor vehicle, that may be one thing. If it's used as a getaway vehicle, maybe another thing. If it's used just to transport a person to or from a location, is that really in furtherance of a crime? I guess I'm raising some of these questions analytically because I'm not sure that just pulling the list of violent crimes out of the statute is a sufficient link to enhance the penalties that are being considered here. Violation of a domestic abuse no contact order, regardless of the penalty level, is listed here. And a DANCO can be violated by one text. And if the person is texting from the passenger seat of the car that they stole a week earlier to a girlfriend or ex-girlfriend, or replies to a girlfriend's text, even though there's a DANCO in place, technically it's the replier who is violating the DANCO, and they'd be looking at the enhanced penalties envisioned in this bill. Same with there's harassment. Misdemeanor level harassment crimes are listed in this statute right now as well, including attempts to commit any of those. If someone tries to send a text and the text doesn't go through, but if it had gone through, it would have violated the Danco, they would qualify for an enhanced penalty for the underlying motor vehicle theft here. So I think we need to think perhaps a little more carefully about that list of violent crimes and whether we really want to cast the net that wide to be effective in deterring auto theft, which I gather is the main point of the bill here. I also had a question about carjackings. Because I don't know this area of the law that well. Prosecutors that prosecute these things on a regular basis, would know them better, would be able to tell us, and maybe Mr. Backus or someone else who's testifying could tell us if there's a carjacking and it's not just a simple auto theft where if a vehicle is stolen out of a parking lot, or it's left running in a driveway and it's stolen, or the ignition is punched. I don't know, can you still punch ignition? I don't even know. And they take a vehicle that's parked down the street. That's one thing. But if a person's in the vehicle and there's violence involved, or the threat of violence or assault that's involved with or without a firearm, because I know the firearm would enhance an assault, a regular assault, or even if it's an assault fear. Are there other crimes that would be charged in a carjacking that may be much more directly related to deterring and creating accountability and consequences than perhaps enhancing the penalty for the auto theft itself? Or maybe we do it in combination. I'm not sure yet, but I guess I'm asking so I can learn the context a little bit better.
Well, Senator Latz, first, I think you wanted a response to the long list of offenses that you reviewed. I'm going to ask Senator Osmek to make a comment on that. Then we'll get back to your carjacking subject.
Thank you.
Senator Osmek.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So this is not specifically related to carjacking. It's the theft of a car, which carjacking, I believe, would qualify. I'm not a lawyer and I don't want to be one. But I think we can get some clarification from staff on that. And to Senator Latz's point regarding the specificity of the crimes that I'm listing here, it's what the crimes that I believe would have connectivity to use of a motorized vehicle. We could certainly debate whether some of these would make sense to be inclusive or not. With kidnapping, a car certainly could be used, stolen, and then kidnap a child, and that there's the connectivity there. That maybe there are some of these references that may not be as solid, and I'd be willing to listen to additions or deletions. But I think the whole point, Senator Latz, is I'm trying to identify subsequent crimes that would have the possibility of a motor vehicle being used in the commission of those offenses. So that's my explanation to why these are specifically called out. As far as the other question, I think we'll have to ask counsel on that.
Senator Johnson, did you want to weigh in on this? I'll get back to you, Senator Latz.
Sure, but yeah, I don't know if Senator touched on that, but the lower level drug possession crimes are some of those that I'd say are not included on the list of examples listed out within the bill there as well. So I don't know if that helps within. We did, pertain to some of the felony level sales crimes. Those are still in there of large quantities, but the lower level drug offenses are not in that list.
Okay, Senator Latz.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Osmek actually used language that might create a valuable distinction here, which is he said regarding the list of violent crimes, trying to make the connection between the stolen vehicle and the use of the vehicle in the commission of a crime, which might be a more valuable way to make the linkage than, say, used in furtherance of a subsequent crime. It's a tighter link relating to the fact that the vehicle was stolen. And so I think that might be something worth taking a look at in addition to maybe using a finer review of which of these crimes, subsequent crimes would be helpful as enhancements.
Senator Osmek.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Senator Latz, well, if you have some suggestions on how to tighten that up, I'm more than happy to, because this is being laid over, I'd be more than happy to entertain them and listen to what your thoughts are.
Be happy to work with you on that.
Senator Ingebrigtsen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just one question to you, Mr. Chair. It's going to be laid over the 72 hours. We're not going to be wedded to that. I mean, that can actually go further, like a week, 2 weeks, or up 60 days, 90 days. We don't have the issue of it having to be reduced just because it goes into a carryover bill, does it?
Senator Ingebrigtsen, we have time to alter this bill as the committee sees fit. If that's something you might want to work on, I'm sure Senator Osmek would want to visit with you.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, and I think by hearing the testimony of the two officers that testified today, that these juveniles understand what's going on. I'm talking about juveniles now, and of course the adults certainly are. So if they know that anything after 72 hours, they can lay low for that period of time, then go out and commit crime. But I do understand Senator Latz's issue here. I mean, you can go out and commit murder without this car and it wouldn't pertain. But if you drove that car to the scene of the murder, it may. So yeah, it needs a little bit of work, but I think this is a good bill, a good way to start.
This reminds me of a previous conversation I had with another senator. If a car is carjacked and then that car is driven into a neighborhood and a bunch of kids get in the car just to go joyriding, is the joyriding passengers, have they committed a crime? That I don't know. And should it be? That may encourage criminal activity of carjacking, but I'm not sure if it meets the whole element of what a crime is. So I don't want to confuse that subject with this issue, but nevertheless, it may come up later on. Senator Kittmeyer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, I think probably the biggest thing that I see here, and when I went to listen to discussion, went back and read the language of the bill again, seeing that the title in subdivision 1 is clearly conduct multiple crimes chargeable for one offense. So I think the biggest thing here is realizing that the car theft may be the first, but it's what comes after that. What is the car used for by the same perpetrator thereafter? So is it used for a variety of number of crimes? And that's what is listed here. So it's not just a car theft. It's a car theft that then is leading to other crimes and a series of crimes starting with the car theft. That's what this bill is about, not those individual ones that we see here right now. So I think it's important to realize that oftentimes the initiating situations like fleeing, you have a situation that starts it. And then after that, there's a series of things, running into another car, harming other people, creating all manner of chaos and confusion. And so these things aren't just anything. They are a violation of law that puts people in danger, creates potential harm, and many times does, certainly in that property. There are people who work very hard to be able to purchase that car. And when you steal a car in your car theft, you're robbing them of what they have earned, what has become theirs that they use to go to work, to go to doctor's appointments, to do a variety of number of things that are very, very important in regards to having that car. Taking that car isn't just about taking the car, it's what you've taken from the owner of that car, harm that is brought to them. This bill in particular about a series of crimes after that. These are serious. They affect public safety. And so, Mr. Chair, I'm glad to see the amendment and that'll be laid over. We'll work on it some more. If we can work on any better language, always glad to do that. Let's be sure these are serious matters. And I don't think anybody's necessarily minimizing it, but I think sometimes, and I've heard here today, of not realizing or emphasizing how important this is to people who get their cars stolen and the sequence of crimes afterwards. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Is there any further discussion regarding Senate File 2843?
Mr. Chairman,
Senator Latz?
thank you. I was still hoping to get a little more clarity on carjacking charging decisions.
Would you want to ask a question of council?
Sure.
Go ahead.
I mean, I assume there are other crimes that are often committed in the course of carjacking, especially, if you got multiple people or gangs that are stealing a bunch of different cars or organizing it, that might be considered a carjacking, right? As was described earlier, but also you've got the case where the owner is approaching their vehicle with the keys in their hand and at the parking lot of the grocery store, and the kids come up, they knock the person over, grab the keys and go. Well, you've got an assault. And if there's an implied threat that they've got a weapon on them, you've got, enhancement relating to that as well. I mean, so what are some of the other elements here that turn a vehicle theft into a carjacking?
Mr. Backus?
Mr. Chair, members, has been said, we don't have a specific carjacking crime in Minnesota. We do have simple robbery and aggravated robbery, which is essentially what I believe a carjacking is. It's basically a theft committed in the presence of another or by taking the property from another, which essentially is what a carjacking is. So I think that's what it would be charged under current law. And you're correct that, there are a number of other crimes that, depending on the circumstances, could be involved, assaults, et cetera. If it's a crime committed for the benefit of the gang, then there's enhancement involved. So yeah, there's a lot of different carjacking provisions. I guess I would, looking at this particular bill, this seems to be a theft bill, not a carjacking bill. This is an enhancement to the theft crime.
Mr. Chair.
Sheriff Fletcher?
Just for clarity, Senator Latz, I think the best definition of the carjacking, which doesn't exist today in statute, is any time that there is force or a threat of force that is used at the time of the taking. And that threat of force can be mere intimidation to get punched, or it can be implication of a gun, or it can be throwing the person to the ground. That's actual physical force. But the definition of robbery really applies to the carjacking. That implies the use of force or the implication or the threat of force.
Thank you, Sheriff. Any further discussion? Seems like we have a lot to talk about before the end of the session. So as we come to a close, I have nothing more on our agenda. So we stand adjourned. Thank you, everyone.